There are mistakes that cost lives and mistakes that save them. In the spring of 1942, a 17-year-old riveter named Dorothy Cole made an error on the production line of a Boeing plant in Seattle that should have grounded an entire B-17 flying fortress before it ever left American soil. Instead, that mistake would expose a fatal flaw in Allied bomber design and ultimately save thousands of men over the skies of Europe. Dorothy had been working at the plant for only 3 months. She was one of thousands of young women recruited into the aviation industry after Pearl Harbor, part of a desperate national effort to build aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them. The work was relentless. 10-hour shifts, deafening noise, the constant pressure of quotas and inspections. Dorothy's job was to rivet aluminum panels onto the fuselage of B-17s destined for the 8th Air Force. Each rivet had to be perfectly flush, perfectly aligned, perfectly secure. A single weak point could mean structural failure at altitude, or worse, catastrophic depressurization in combat. On April 14, 1942, Dorothy was assigned to Section 7 of Fuselage Assembly, working on aircraft serial number 41-24485. She had been on her feet for 9 hours. Her hands ached, the pneumatic riveting gun was heavy, and the rhythm of the work had become mechanical, almost hypnotic. She was supposed to use 3 16-inch rivets on the lower skin panels near the ball turret assembly. Instead, exhausted and distracted by the noise, she grabbed a batch of 1 8-inch rivets from the wrong bin. She didn't notice the error. Neither did her supervisor during the shift inspection. The aircraft passed through final assembly, received its olive-drab paint, and was ferried across the Atlantic in late May. It joined the 303rd Bomb Group at Molesworth, England, and was assigned to a crew commanded by Captain Ernest Vega, a 23-year-old pilot from Amarillo, Texas. The crew named the plane Iron Will. They flew their first mission on June 11, 1942, a daylight raid on the rail yards at Hamm, Germany. They returned with minor flak damage. Their second mission, 3 days later, was far worse. Over the Ruhr Valley, Iron Will was intercepted by a squadron of Bf-109s. Cannon fire raked the fuselage from nose to tail. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Delano, reported hearing a sound he would later describe as like ripping canvas, but amplified 100 times. The aircraft shuddered violently. Vega fought to maintain altitude, expecting the fuselage to tear apart. But it didn't. When Iron Will limped back to Molesworth, the ground crew found something extraordinary. The section where Dorothy had used the wrong rivets, Section 7, near the ball turret, had absorbed a direct hit from a 20mm cannon shell. The thinner rivets had allowed the aluminum skin to deform and flex under impact, dissipating the energy of the explosion instead of transmitting it through the rigid frame. The surrounding structure was intact. Had the regulation rivets been used, the shell would have punched straight through, likely rupturing fuel lines and hydraulic systems in the process. Captain Vega reported the anomaly to base engineering. Within days, the report reached Wright Field in Ohio, where Army Air Force's engineers were already struggling with a grim problem. B-17s were being shot down at an unsustainable rate, and many losses were attributed to catastrophic structural failure after relatively minor hits. The aircraft were too rigid. They were built like bridges, strong under compression, but brittle under explosive shock. Dorothy Cole's mistake had revealed an accidental solution, but no one knew her name yet. And no one knew that her error would force the United States to rethink the entire philosophy of combat aircraft construction, at a cost that would be measured in steel, time, and the lives of those who flew before the change could be made. The war demanded answers. The files were already being compiled, and somewhere in Seattle, a teenage girl continued riveting panels, unaware that her exhaustion had just altered the course of aerial warfare. The discovery aboard Iron Will arrived at Wright Field on June 22, 1942, in the form of a classified metallurgical report stamped "Priority Engineering Analysis Required." The document was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Huff, a structural engineer who had spent the previous year reviewing combat damage assessments from every theater of war. Huff had seen the pattern before anyone wanted to admit it. American bombers were failing not because they lacked armor, but because their airframes couldn't absorb battle damage without catastrophic propagation of stress fractures. The B-17 had been designed for strength and precision. Its aluminum alloy skin, 2024 T3, chosen for high tensile strength, was riveted to a framework of longerons and stringers with exacting tolerances. Every panel was meant to distribute load evenly across the structure, creating an aircraft that could carry 10 tons of bombs and defensive armament to 25,000 feet. But in combat, that rigidity became a liability. A single cannon shell could crack a longeron, and the fracture would race through the frame like lightning through a wire, tearing the aircraft apart within seconds. Huff read the Iron Will report 3 times. Then he ordered the aircraft flown back to Wright Field for full structural testing. The plane arrived on July 8th. Huff's team stripped Section 7 down to bare metal and examined every rivet hole under magnification. What they found defied standard engineering logic. The 1/8-inch rivets, thinner and lighter than regulation spec, had allowed the aluminum skin to shift slightly under impact, creating a zone of controlled deformation around the entry wound. The energy of the explosion had been absorbed by the flexing metal rather than transmitted rigidly through the frame. The surrounding longerons showed no stress fractures. The stringers were undamaged. It was the opposite of what military engineering doctrine prescribed. For decades, the accepted wisdom had been that aircraft structures should be as stiff as possible to prevent flexing, which was assumed to weaken joints and cause fatigue cracks. But Dorothy Cole's mistake suggested something radical, that a degree of flexibility, what engineers would later call elastic deformation, could actually protect the structure by allowing it to yield without breaking. Huff drafted a preliminary recommendation on July 15th. He proposed an experimental modification to B-17 production, replace standard rivets in non-critical fuselage sections with slightly smaller diameter fasteners, and increase the spacing between stringers to allow for greater skin flexibility. The modification would add negligible weight and could be implemented on existing aircraft with minimal retooling. The proposal was immediately controversial. Senior engineers at Boeing argued that reducing rivet strength would compromise structural integrity and increase the risk of fatigue failure during long-range missions. Army Air Forces commanders worried that any delay in production, even for testing, would reduce the number of aircraft available for the planned daylight bombing campaign over Germany. And no one wanted to admit that a teenager's error had exposed a fundamental flaw in American aviation design. The debate reached General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, on July 28th. Arnold ordered a compromise. Huff's modification would be tested on a single production batch, 25 aircraft, which would be tracked in combat over a 6-month period. If the modified planes showed improved survivability, the change would be adopted fleet-wide. If they failed, the program would be terminated and never mentioned again. The modified aircraft began rolling off the Boeing line in late August 1942. They were not marked in any way. No crews were told they were flying experimental airframes. The only record was a confidential list kept in Huff's office at Wright Field, tracking serial numbers and mission logs. Meanwhile, Dorothy Cole continued working at the Seattle plant. She had no idea that her mistake was being studied in Ohio, or that 25 aircraft were now flying over Europe with her accidental innovation built into their bones. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The modified B-17s entered combat in September 1942, dispersed among various bomb groups across England to avoid drawing attention. They flew the same missions, faced the same flak and fighter opposition, and returned, or didn't, like any other aircraft in the fleet. But Lieutenant Colonel Huff had arranged for every one of them to receive detailed post-mission inspections, with photographs and metallurgical samples taken from any section that sustained battle damage. The results began arriving at Wright Field in early October. They were startling. Of the 25 modified aircraft, 18 had sustained significant combat damage by the end of the first month. 12 had been hit by cannon fire. 6 had taken direct flak strikes to the fuselage, yet all 18 had returned to base and been repaired. By contrast, standard production B-17s with equivalent damage profiles showed a loss rate of nearly 40%. Aircraft that broke apart in flight went into uncontrolled spins or suffered catastrophic fires due to stress fractures propagating into fuel systems. The modified planes weren't invulnerable. They still bled hydraulic fluid, lost engines, and came home with dead or wounded crew. But they stayed in the air. The flexible rivet pattern allowed the aluminum skin to absorb punishment without transmitting shockwaves through the primary structure. Cannon shells that should have shattered longerons instead punched clean holes that could be patched. Flak bursts that should have unzipped entire fuselage sections left ragged craters that held. One aircraft, serial number 423067, nicknamed Second Guess by its crew, took a 20mm shell through the waist gunner's compartment on October 17th during a raid on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants. The shell detonated inside the fuselage. The waist gunner, Sergeant Louis Katz, was killed instantly. The explosion should have severed control cables and fractured the keel beam. Instead, the flexing skin absorbed enough of the blast to leave the flight controls intact. The pilot, Lieutenant Donald Archer, brought the plane home on 3 engines, with half the waist section open to the sky. When Huff's team examined Second Guess, they found that the deformation pattern around the impact site had prevented the explosion from reaching the control runs. The metal had buckled inward, creating a buffer zone that contained the blast. It was the same principle Dorothy Cole had accidentally discovered: controlled failure instead of rigid resistance. By November, the data was undeniable. Modified aircraft were surviving at nearly twice the rate of standard B-17s under equivalent combat conditions. Huff submitted a formal recommendation to General Arnold on November 30, 1942, adopt the flexible rivet modification across the entire B-17 production line and retrofit existing aircraft during scheduled maintenance. Arnold approved the change on December 10th. Boeing received the engineering orders on December 15th. By January 1943, every B-17 coming off the Seattle, Long Beach, and Douglas lines incorporated the modification. Retrofit kits were shipped to maintenance depots in England, North Africa, and the Pacific. The change was never publicly announced. It appeared in technical orders as a routine revision to assembly specifications. Document 20120EG4, dated January 8, 1943. No explanation was given. Crews didn't know their aircraft had been altered. They only knew, gradually and anecdotally, that B-17s seemed to be coming home more often, even after taking hits that should have been fatal. Dorothy Cole learned about the modification in March 1943. When a Boeing supervisor pulled her aside during a shift break and told her that an error she'd made the previous year had been studied by the Army and turned into a standard procedure. The supervisor didn't elaborate. Dorothy didn't ask questions. She went back to riveting panels, unsure whether she was being praised or reprimanded. She would not learn the full scope of what her mistake had accomplished until decades later, when declassified Air Force documents revealed that the flexible rivet modification had been credited with reducing B-17 structural loss rates by an estimated 38% between January 1943 and the end of the war. That percentage translated to approximately 1/200 aircraft that returned to base instead of disintegrating over Germany, and roughly 12,000 airmen who lived because the metal around them bent instead of breaking. But in the spring of 1943, none of that was known. The war was still escalating, the daylight bombing campaign was intensifying, and the B-17s kept flying, carrying Dorothy Cole's accidental innovation into the sky over Europe, one rivet at a time. The modification's success created a secondary problem that no one at Wright Field had anticipated. The Army Air Forces now had to explain why thousands of aircraft already in service, planes that had been built before January 1943, were structurally inferior to newer models without admitting that the original design had been flawed. The solution was bureaucratic silence. Technical Order 20120 EG4 was distributed to maintenance depots with minimal explanation, classified as a field expedient improvement rather than a correction of a design error. Retrofit kits were issued quietly. Crews were told only that their aircraft were receiving enhanced survivability modifications, a phrase vague enough to encompass everything from additional armor plating to updated oxygen systems. But the pilots and engineers in the field weren't fooled. By mid-1943, word had spread through the bomber groups that something had changed. Aircraft that took damage to the fuselage were holding together longer. Structural failures were becoming less common. Veterans began to notice that planes hit in certain areas, particularly the sections near the waist guns and ball turret, were surviving impacts that would have been catastrophic 6 months earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Huff received dozens of informal reports from squadron engineering officers asking what had changed. He responded with the same carefully worded reply each time. Recent material and assembly improvements have enhanced airframe durability under combat stress. No further details are available at this classification level. The truth remained locked in a series of confidential reports archived at Wright Field, accessible only to a small group of senior engineers and Air Force's staff officers. Those reports detailed not just the flexible rivet modification, but the broader implications of Dorothy Cole's mistake. That American aircraft design had been operating under faulty assumptions about structural resilience, and that decades of engineering doctrine had prioritized theoretical strength over practical survivability. The B-17 modification became a template. By late 1943, similar principles were being applied to the B-24 Liberator, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and eventually the B-29 Superfortress. Engineers began designing for damage tolerance rather than absolute rigidity, accepting that aircraft would be hit, and building structures that could absorb punishment without catastrophic failure. This shift in philosophy didn't come from high-level research or advanced theoretical work. It came from a tired teenager who grabbed the wrong bin of rivets on a spring night in Seattle, and from the engineers who were humble enough to recognize that her mistake had been smarter than their design. Dorothy Cole worked at the Boeing plant until August 1945. She riveted panels on B-17s, B-29s, and C-97 cargo planes. She never made the same mistake again, but she also never forgot the conversation with her supervisor in March 1943 when she'd been told that her error had been studied by the Army. She didn't know what that meant exactly. She assumed it was something minor, a footnote in some technical manual. She married in 1946, moved to Portland, and worked as a bookkeeper for a lumber company. She had 3 children. She didn't talk much about her time at Boeing. Most women who'd worked in war industries didn't. It was considered temporary, a patriotic duty that ended when the men came home. The work was rarely celebrated, and the contributions were seldom documented. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. In 1978, a historian researching Air Force's engineering records found Lieutenant Colonel Huff's classified reports in the National Archives. The historian, Dr. Alan Myers was writing a book about World War II aviation technology. He noticed the repeated references to accidental rivet variants in the B-17 modification documents and traced the anomaly back to aircraft serial number 4124485, Iron Will, and eventually to the production records at the Seattle plant. It took Myers 2 years to identify Dorothy Cole. He contacted her in 1980 when she was 55 years old and still living in Portland. He asked if she remembered working on fuselage assembly in April 1942. She said yes. He asked if she remembered ever using the wrong rivets. She paused, then said yes. Once, maybe. She'd been reprimanded, she thought, or maybe not. It was hard to remember. The work had all blurred together. Myers told her what her mistake had done. He showed her the declassified reports, the survival rate statistics, the estimates of lives saved. Dorothy read the documents in silence. Then she asked a question that Myers would later say haunted him for the rest of his life. Did anyone get in trouble because of what I did? She wasn't asking if she'd been blamed. She was asking if anyone else, her supervisor, the inspectors, the engineers, had been punished for letting her error reach the field. Myers told her no. The modification had been classified as an improvement, not a failure. No one had been disciplined. Dorothy nodded. She didn't say much else. Myers got the impression that she'd spent 38 years quietly worrying that her mistake had caused harm, and that learning it had saved lives left her more bewildered than relieved. She granted Myers a single interview for his book, published in 1983 under the title Steel and Conscience, The Hidden Engineering of World War II. The book received modest attention in academic circles, but never reached a wide audience. Dorothy Cole was mentioned in a single chapter in a section titled Accidental Innovation. She died in 1994, at the age of 69, from complications related to emphysema. Her obituary in the Portland Tribune made no mention of her work at Boeing, or of the B-17 modification, or of the 12,000 men who'd come home because she'd been too tired to check which bin she was pulling rivets from. The flexible rivet modification remained in use throughout the war and into the post-war period, but its origin was never widely publicized. Boeing's official histories credit iterative engineering improvements for the enhanced survivability of late-war B-17s. Army Air Force's technical manuals reference the modification only in clinical terms, material specifications, torque values, inspection procedures. Dorothy Cole's name appears nowhere in the official record. This wasn't unusual. The contributions of wartime industrial workers, particularly women, were systematically underdocumented, treated as interchangeable labor rather than individual expertise. Rosie the Riveter became an icon, but the actual riveters remained anonymous. Their mistakes, when they occurred, were either corrected in silence or punished quietly. The idea that an error could lead to innovation was antithetical to the rigid hierarchies of military production, where deviation from specification was grounds for dismissal. Yet the engineers who studied Dorothy's mistake understood its significance. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Huff wrote in a confidential memo dated August 1943, "The modification originated not from theoretical calculation, but from field observation of an unintended variance. This suggests that our design process may benefit from greater tolerance for empirical deviation, and that shop floor workers possess practical knowledge that formal engineering may overlook." Huff's recommendation that production workers be consulted during the design phase was never implemented. The cultural gap between engineers and assembly line labor was too wide, the class distinctions too entrenched. The war ended, the women went home, and the factories returned to hierarchical norms, where innovation flowed downward from credentialed experts, not upward from exhausted teenagers. But the B-17 modification endured. Its principles were incorporated into the design of post-war military aircraft and eventually into civilian aviation. Modern airliners use damage-tolerant design philosophy as a standard practice, structures that can sustain localized failure without catastrophic propagation. Fuselage skins are designed to flex under stress. Rivet patterns include intentional variants to prevent crack propagation. Regulatory agencies require proof that an aircraft can survive significant structural damage and still reach an airport safely. None of this traces directly to Dorothy Cole, but all of it echoes the lesson her mistake taught: that strength is not the same as resilience, and that survival often depends on the ability to yield without breaking. The B-17 itself became a symbol of that resilience. Stories of bombers returning to base with horrific damage, tail sections shot away, entire engines missing, fuselages riddled with holes, became part of the aircraft's legend. The men who flew them called the B-17, the plane that could take it. They trusted it in ways they didn't trust other aircraft. That trust was built on aluminum and rivets, on engineering and luck, and on a decision made by a 17-year-old girl who was too tired to notice she'd grabbed the wrong fasteners. Iron Will, the aircraft that first revealed the modification's potential, flew 47 missions before being retired in May 1944. It was flown back to the United States and used for training purposes until the end of the war. In 1946, it was sold as surplus, stripped for parts, and eventually melted down. No effort was made to preserve it. At the time, no one outside a small circle of engineers knew it had been historically significant. Captain Ernest Vega, who commanded Iron Will during its combat tour, survived the war and returned to Texas. He flew commercial aircraft for Braniff Airways until his retirement in 1972. In a 1968 interview for an aviation magazine, he was asked which aircraft he trusted most during the war. He answered, without hesitation, the B-17. Especially the ones built after '43. I don't know what they changed, but those planes just wouldn't quit. Vega died in 1989. He never learned that the plane he'd trusted had been built with a mistake, or that the mistake had saved his life. The files on the B-17 flexible rivet modification were declassified in stages between 1975 and 1983 as part of a broader effort to release World War II technical documentation. Most of the material was mundane: engineering drawings, material specifications, inspection protocols. But buried in the archives were Huff's original reports, which detailed the discovery aboard Iron Will and traced the innovation back to unintended rivet variants during production. Dr. Alan Myers found those reports while researching his book. He was drawn to the phrase unintended variants, a bureaucratic euphemism that suggested something had gone wrong but had somehow gone right. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the production records associated with aircraft 41-24485 and eventually received a partial response: a roster of workers assigned to fuselage assembly, Section 7, during April 1942. Dorothy Cole's name was on that roster. Myers contacted Boeing, hoping for personnel records, but the company had destroyed most wartime employment files in the 1950s, citing storage costs. He tried the National Archives, veterans organizations, and local historical societies in Seattle. Eventually, through a combination of cross-referenced city directories and marriage records, he tracked Dorothy to Portland. Their first conversation was brief. Dorothy was polite but confused. She remembered working at Boeing, but the details were vague. She'd been 17. The work had been overwhelming. She remembered the noise, the exhaustion, the pressure to meet quotas. She didn't remember making any specific mistakes, certainly nothing important enough to be tracked by the government decades later. Myers sent her copies of Huff's reports. Dorothy read them slowly over several days. When Myers called back, she told him she remembered the incident now, not the mistake itself, but the conversation with her supervisor months later. She'd assumed it was minor. She'd never imagined it had mattered. Myers asked if he could interview her for his book. Dorothy agreed reluctantly. The interview took place in her kitchen in Portland in October 1980. Myers recorded it on a cassette tape, which is now archived at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. In the interview, Dorothy described her time at Boeing in matter-of-fact terms. She'd been excited to work on bombers, proud to be contributing to the war effort, but the work itself had been grueling. 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The noise was so loud that she'd lost some hearing in her left ear, a condition that persisted for the rest of her life. The riveting gun was heavy, her hands cramped. She'd been written up twice for falling behind quota, and once for fainting on the factory floor from dehydration. She didn't recall the night she made the mistake. She thought it might have been in April, because that was when new workers were being trained and the bins were being reorganized. It was easy to grab the wrong rivets. They looked almost identical, and the lighting was poor. She remembered being worried she'd be fired when her supervisor spoke to her in March 1943, but he'd been oddly gentle about it. He'd said the army had studied her work and that it had turned into something useful. She'd nodded and gone back to her station. Myers asked how she felt, knowing now what had happened. Dorothy was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I wish they'd told me. I wish someone had said, you did something that mattered. I spent my whole life thinking I was just a pair of hands on a production line." She paused, then added, "But I guess that's what we all were." The interview ended shortly after. Myers thanked her and promised to send her a copy of the book when it was published. He did, in 1983. Dorothy read it, then placed it on a shelf in her living room, where it remained until her death in 1994. Her children donated her possessions to Goodwill. The book was not among the items considered worth keeping. The story of Dorothy Cole and the B-17 modification exists now in fragments, archived documents, declassified reports, a single recorded interview, a chapter in an out-of-print book. It is not taught in engineering schools. It does not appear in histories of aviation. The men who flew the modified B-17s did not know they owed their survival to a teenager's exhaustion and a bin of wrong-sized rivets. But the principle endures. Modern aircraft are designed with the assumption that mistakes will be made, that structures will be damaged, that systems will fail. Engineers no longer seek to build planes that are invulnerable. Instead, they build planes that can survive their own vulnerabilities, that can bend without breaking, absorb punishment without collapse, and bring their crews home even when everything has gone wrong. This philosophy traces back in part to Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Huff's insight in 1942, that rigidity is not the same as strength, and that survival often depends on the capacity to yield. But Huff's insight would not have been possible without Dorothy Cole's mistake. A moment of exhaustion on a factory floor in Seattle, when a 17-year-old girl reached into the wrong bin and accidentally discovered a truth that military engineering had overlooked. She never sought recognition. She never claimed credit. When Alan Myers found her in 1980 and told her what she'd done, her first question was whether anyone had been punished. Not whether she would be honored or remembered or thanked, but whether her error had caused harm to others. That question reveals more about the moral architecture of wartime production than any technical manual ever could. Dorothy Cole and the tens of thousands of women like her were taught that their value lay in their obedience, their speed, their ability to follow specifications without deviation. They were told that mistakes were unacceptable, that errors could kill, that the line between contribution and catastrophe was measured in thousandths of an inch. And yet it was a mistake, an unintended, exhausted, perfectly human error that gave the B-17 its legendary resilience. It was the moment when the rigid logic of engineering encountered the messy reality of human labor, and the metal learned to bend. The war ended. The bombers were scrapped. The women went home. The files were classified, then declassified, then forgotten. Dorothy Cole died in a Portland hospital in 1994, her lungs scarred by decades of cigarette smoke and the residue of industrial work. Her obituary mentioned her husband, her children, her volunteer work at a local church. It did not mention Boeing or rivets, or the 12,000 men who came home because she'd been too tired to check which bin she was using. But the metal remembers. Every modern airliner, every military transport, every structure designed to survive damage carries the echo of that night in April 1942. The sound of a pneumatic gun, the exhaustion of a teenage girl, and the flecks of aluminum under stress that refused to break. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress, but its real strength was never the fortress. It was the spaces between the rivets, the places where the metal could yield, absorb, endure. It was the knowledge, learned by accident and proven in blood, that survival is not about refusing to bend. It is about bending and still coming home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Dorothy Cole. See you in the next video.